Hi, welcome back to Learn the Nette Web Development Framework. We're working on part 3 of the series. We're going to add authorization to our website. We've already worked through authentication, which is to say we have a table of users and passwords, and we can sign in and sign up to the site, and we can authenticate the fact that we actually should have access to the site. But what we haven't done is differentiate different roles in the site, and at this point we have no way. If you've signed up several different users, all users have access to all podcasts entries, and they can edit and delete any of them, and that's not what we want. We want to have a role of member, so that a member can get to their individual podcast entries and be able to edit and add and delete their own. And we're probably also going to want to have a role for administrator, so that there is someone who can go in and really edit and delete any of the podcasts as sort of the super user or the administrator. So we're going to do that. The first thing we need to do is make some changes to our database to create a relationship between our newly created user table and our podcast table. So we'll go over to localhost, and I'm using XAMPP. This is how I get to the dashboard here, and there's a link to Phpmyadmin, which gives us direct control over our database and how we want it to work. And I've named my database for this site Podcast Collective. And I have a couple tables. I have podcasts and users. And now I need to create a relationship between the user and the podcast, so that every podcast has a user. And a user is able to create as many podcasts as entries as they like. So it's a one-to-many relationship. One user can create many podcasts. So the first thing we need to do is, in order to create this relationship, we've got to go to podcasts, and we have to enter a column here for user ID to associate a particular user or a member with the podcast entries that they have created. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to structure, and we're going to add a new column, and we're going to add one column, and we're going to go after ID, and we'll hit go. And now it's going to be an integer. The name of it is going to be user ID, so it's telling us what table and what column we're looking for, and it's as a foreign key, and that's kind of by convention, that naming convention there. We're not going to allow it to be null, because we want every podcast to have an owner or an author, so we don't have any empty ones there. And that's really all we have to do. We'll save that. That's great. So now we have a user ID column in our podcast table. We need to do one thing here. We need to make sure we've indexed this table to make these relationships work. And we'll go ahead and hit index that table. You can tell it's indexed by that kind of grayed out key. It's not the primary key, which is the gold key, but it is an indexed value. Okay. So the next thing to do here, we're going to create that relationship. And I like to use this. If you'll go to the database itself, we're going to use the designer in Phpmyadmin. I think it's kind of handy tool to create relationships. We have the podcasts here, and we have the users table here, kind of a nice little entity relationship diagram here. It gives a visual of what's going on, and we can create relationships using this little tool right here called Create Relationship. The first thing you're going to do is select the referenced key. The referenced key in this case is going to be the users. Right, that's the referenced key, and that's the key that the podcast is referencing when it's looking for its owner or its user. Okay, click that one, and then you'll go ahead and select the foreign key, which is in this case is user ID. Click that one, and we're going to create some constraints. I want to cascade this. If I delete a user, I want it to cascade to the podcast that they have authored. So, and that's also true with update. If I update a user, particularly if I update their ID, I want to make sure that cascades through to the podcast that they own. We'll say OK, and I bet I'm going to get an error. Yeah, I did. So here's what I've done wrong, and I've done this wrong a couple times, but this will give us a little practice. I forgot to go over here to podcasts. I'm going to go back to this table right here. And right now you can see that the user IDs that I have for the podcast that I've created say 0. Well, we can't have that. There is no user with a user ID of 0. As a matter of fact, here's my user IDs right here in this table. I better know what those are. If they're 3, 5, and 6. Now, if you've been adding users to your application, and I hope that you have, this test will be much more visually interesting if you've added some users. So if you haven't yet, go ahead and use your application to add some. But it's very likely that your user IDs will be different than mine. I've done some, bounce around here and making some mistakes and deleting some users as I get ready for this tutorial. And so mine have these odd numbers of 3, 5, and 6. But these are the only numbers that I can use when I add user ID to my table podcasts, which is what I'm going to do now. So let's go over here and put in some user IDs that actually exist from the user table, and we're going to go ahead and edit them all. Let's check them all, and let's go ahead and edit. And remember, for me it's 3, 5, and 6, so I got to add 3, and then 5, and then 6. So now my situation will work. Hit go here. Everything worked just fine. We're going to go back to the database, and we're going to take a look again at this designer, and we're going to do our deal. There's users again, podcast. I'm going to move this a little bit so things don't bounce around too much. So again, create a relationship, and the first thing it wants to do is select the referenced key. The referenced key is, let me get this over a little bit. It doesn't want to. Let's move it down. Come on, stop that. Stop it. Yeah, is ID, that's the reference key. I want that, that's what I'm referencing from my podcasts. And then I go over here to the foreign key, which I've named user ID. Click that one. Again, I'm going to have this constraint on there that says I want you to cascade a delete. If I delete a user, I want all the podcasts related to that user to be deleted. And if I update the user, I want that to cascade as well. So we'll have that happening. And we'll say OK, and use the functionality here, processing the request. And as you can see now, I'm going from user ID to ID. That's the direction of my relationship. And just to confirm that, yep, that's exactly what I want. So this big half bubble going down to the ID. This is the referenced column to the user ID in podcasts. And so now I've set things up correctly for success when we go to make changes to our application. So that'll be the next thing that we do, and I'll be back in a moment. Before we leave Phpmyadmin, there's one more change that we should go ahead and make to our database so that we don't have to come back again, and the changes that we make to the application in Visual Studio Code will make more sense. Let's go to users, the table users, and we need to add another column here for role. Remember, we're talking about the notion that we're going to have an administrator, and then we're going to have members. And we have to identify that in our users table here. We want to create a column for role. So let's go ahead and add that to the structure of our database. We're going to add a new column. We're going to do it after password. So go ahead and say go. And we're going to have, the name of it will be role, and it is going to be a varchar. Makes the most sense. And I don't know how many, 255 always is a great one. There's not going to be a default, and it cannot be null. We don't want to have a null value. Every entry here, everybody's got to have a role. So we're going to go ahead and save that one. And that's great. We are going to add roles in now in our browse. I'm going to browse this table because since we're here, we might as well go ahead and do it. So just for ease of doing this, let's go ahead and check all, and we're going to edit them. You can do this differently than I'm doing it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to call these first two guys. I'm going to call them members. Yep. Member, and this guy's going to be a member, and this last guy is going to be, last user is going to be an admin. And just for the sake of getting this going here, we'll go ahead and add those values. Go. And it looks like everything happened the way it should. We have a member, we have another member, and we have an administrator, an admin. So we'll be using those values as we implement authorization in our podcast collective site. And then we'll be doing that in just a minute. Okay, we're back at the podcast collective website, and we're ready to begin making some changes to our application so that we can add the functionality for authorization based on roles. And whether you're an admin or a member, your access to particular parts of the site are controlled by your role. So let's make that work. So going back to Visual Studio Code, we're in the podcast collective, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a change to the model podcast facade. And I'm already here in podcast facade. I've already added this one, but here's what we're adding. We're adding a new data object, and this is so that we can access member podcasts based on their user ID. So we're going to create a function here, get member podcast. We're going to pass in the parameter user ID, call it UID, and we're going to return the value of the podcast table based upon where the user ID, remember that's the column that we've added a podcast, where the user ID is in that column is equal to the user ID we're passing to this function. So creating a new data object to use from podcast facade. All right, the next thing we need to do is make a small change to podcast authenticator. That's another one of our models. You'll find it under the models directory. We simply need to uncomment this guy right here. In the one that I have on my GitHub repository, this is commented out. We now have that row to access, the role for role, and we need to be able to access that so that we can determine the role that a user has. Finally, we need to go to the presenter, podcast presenter, and make a change to a particular function here, and it's the function render table contents. Right now, whenever we look at the table of podcast entries, you just get them all, and there's no way to differentiate whether if you're a user or a member. You just get everything. Well, we need to put in a conditional in there. If you are a role admin, you get a certain access, and if you are in a role member, you get a different access. And so it looks like this. I'm just going to copy and paste this so you don't have to suffer through my poor typing. And we'll copy this out, put it right here. We're simply making a conditional so that we get one thing or another. And we'll paste that in, and I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing is we're going to say, well, if you're a user, we have to create a variable for our user. And that's using this get user function or parameter. And so if your user is in the role admin, then you get the facade get all podcasts. We want to be able to see all of the podcasts. So we're going to get that data object, the one that gives you everything. Else if you're in the role member, then you're going to get the get member podcast, and we're going to pass that function the parameter of the user ID, and that's how you get to the user ID. All right, so pretty straightforward. We want to be able to, in one case we can render one data object, and in a different case we're going to render another data object, and that's kind of how I've chosen to distinguish between user roles in my presenter. Okay, so let's see if this works. We're going to save everything. Oh, one last thing I don't want to forget to mention. We're likely going to need to add this line to get to the authenticator. We are using the functions in that class. So we're going to need to add that line in. Okay, so let's save them all, and that should do it. Now let's go out to the application. Let me go back to where we were. I'm just going to refresh the whole thing here. See where I'm going to sign out. I don't know what I was signed in. So if we sign up now, or I'm sorry, not sign up, but if we sign in now, we can. I'm going to do it with my a user I know is just as a member role. So it's in my case. And let's see what we get there. and go to the collection. And yep, and we're just getting the particular podcast entry that user who has the role member has authored. If I sign out and sign in with a member who I know has the role admin, I should get them all. So that's the theory, right? And super secret password. And if I go to the collection now, yep, get all the podcast entries that have been created in our site so far. Okay, so yeah, everything works as expected. There's a lot of work still to do to this site. This probably shouldn't say my collection. It probably should identify who is it that's logged in. There's work to be done. If you go out here, we still have some links that don't work yet. So there's work that we'd want to finish off to get this really ready to be useful. But I think, and I hope that I've introduced you to most of the functionality in the Nette web application development framework. I really like it the more I use it. I think it's really a handy tool if you're working on a web app. And as I mentioned before, I think it hits the sweet spot between something that's a little too simple, creates a little too much work to get going. Something like, I don't know, Flask, a little more sophisticated, I think, than Code Igniter, and it's just a really handy tool. I appreciate you following along this tutorial, and if you found these useful, please let me know. Hit a comment. If there's something that you'd like to see, please leave a comment. And I'd appreciate it if you'd like or subscribe. All right, thanks for tuning in.